All right, everybody, Quantum back here again, and as we have been doing for the month of April 2024, we are taking a look at some meta competitive decks that you could be using for the store championships that are coming up. And in this video, we're taking a look at Emerald, Amethyst, Tempo, Aggro. I did do a gameplay video on this, which is linked in the description, where we took a look at this deck going against some of its tougher matchups in Emerald Steel and Amber Steel Song. And while this deck can struggle against Steel on the play, I think this deck is definitely a contender to beat any deck in the format because it's just that good and that fast. Before we get started in today's video, though, just a couple of quick notes as usual. A quick shout out to the Patreon supporter, Bo, who's my first Patreon supporter, so thank you for that. Jipton, who contributed another donation to me, so again, huge thank you to you. And the two members on the channel, Harry and Kevin. If you do want to support this channel in other ways other than just liking and subscribing, there are some options in the description where you can become a member. You can do a PayPal donation or a Patreon or become a Patreon member. But again, you don't have to do that. It's only if you feel like you want to support the channel a little bit more. I'm more than happy to continue to put out this content for you guys for free. A like and or comment would be appreciated, though, if you do enjoy the content. With that being said, though, let's go ahead and jump into the profile. The gameplay video did utilize some tech options like Bippity Boppity Boo and Befuddles, but I've opted to cut them from this list, and I'll explain why in just a second. Starting things off, we are going with the 4 Merfolk, the 4 Rafiki, and 3 copies of Chernobog Followers. If you've looked at any top like big tournament lists from Ink decks or anything like that, you would have seen that anybody playing Emerald, Amethyst, Aggro is essentially going with this kind of ratio for their 1-drops. The Chernobog Followers is one of those cards that works very well in this deck because after you get some advantage off of the questing, you can also just banish this to draw cards and replace it with hopefully a bigger threat that you can quest with later on. You don't necessarily need to manage a lot of board presence, since once you get your lore, you're fine with just replacing these cards. And this is what Emerald Amethyst always has wanted to do in Rise of the Floodborn in the first chapter, but it really struggled to do that and keep up with card advantage, even though Amethyst is very good at drawing cards. Obviously, we got a very strong pairing in the Into the Inkland set with the Ursula Deceiver of All, which we're going to review in just a bit. But this ratio works very well. This usually ensures that on your mulligan, you should always have something to play on turn 1, which is very powerful. Usually, your best turn 1 drop is going to be Curse Merfolk. But in my Ruby Amethyst video, I talked about instances where you would likely value the Rafiki a little bit more on the 1-drop. If you're going up against like an aggro mirror or another aggressive deck and you're on the draw, let's say, maybe dropping this down on turn 1 is a little bit more valuable than dropping a Cursed Merfolk in certain scenarios. But this card can really just help you get a lot of lore early on, and it usually trades at least 1-for-1 unless it gets hit by a Cinderella singing like Let the Storm Rage On or something, because that card replaces itself while it outs your threat. But even if you don't end up questing with it before it gets outed, if it gets like Fire the Cannons or something, you still at least trade 1-for-1. Yes, you do lose the lore, and that's kind of what you're aiming for. But in certain scenarios, baiting out removal with the Rafiki or the Chernobog Followers might be beneficial so that you can drop this later on and get your lore off of it. So again, it seems like a pretty straightforward deck with, aggro. I just play things and turn things sideways. But as usual, your 1-drops and stuff do play a role your thought process and how you play your 1-drops should play a role in how you develop your board later on. For the 2-drop slot, we are going with the 4 Flynn Riders. Again, this is just more aggro pressure, but it has the same effect as Curse Merfolk, as when it's challenged, your opponent has to discard a card. So ideally, this card always trades 1-for-1, and if you do end up questing for 2 before it trades 1-for-1, that's just an additional lore gain for you on top of the positive trade. For Ursula Deceiver, this card has really made Emerald a lot more viable nowadays because you can rip out the songs like Grab Your Swords, A Whole New World, etc. Be prepared on turn 6, let's say, before they have the ink to cast it. And this card played in the right way is able to allow you to maintain your developed board and continue questing. A lot of times your opponent might be setting up for like a big Grab Your Swords play. If you can read that coming in, like they have a shift target on board or something, you drop this, you out to Grab Your Swords, and now your opponent has to reevaluate their game plan. Unlikely to out your developed your board fully, and therefore they may out 2 or 3 things, but you still have some things left on the board that would have normally been wiped out with their song that you're able to pull out with the Ursula. So while this is still a good card to play on turn 2, the real benefit of this is knowing what are the lines of play my opponent has? Do they have a Shift Robin Hood ready to drop on turn 3 or turn 4, 5, 6, whenever they end up establishing that? Are they looking to shift the tank and do the grab your swords play to deal 3 damage to everything on board? Are they preparing to sing a whole new world or sing a be prepared or or just hardcast to be prepared? There's a lot of reads that you can make with this card that can make it very beneficial beyond just, hey, it's a card I play on turn 2 and just rip whatever I can, right? Strategically, and if you want to be a good player, you have to know when to cast this in order to get the most benefit. In addition to 2-drops, one of the cards that work very well with this deck now with the introduction of Into the Inklands is MIM Snake. Artabax is probably the best Emerald Amethyst player I've seen play this deck. And he talks a lot about, you don't just want to, like, while it's okay to quest, get your lore, and this gets challenged and banished, and yes, your opponent discards, so it goes 1 for 1. You can do so much more with a card like this. Like, you want to always kind of play this in a way that you can protect it so that you can recast it and just quest again, because this card does represent, cheap lore gain, very valuable lore gain, and it usually, like I said, always trades 1 for 1. So pairing this with the MIM Snake or MIM Fox works very well, and it's one of the reasons why this deck or this ink pairing works very well Into the Inklands, is because you have very powerful cards that are actually worth snaking back to hand to protect in order to recast for very cheap, right? Like, this card out of 1 cost represents so much value, and so that really makes the difference between a person who can win with this deck versus somebody who just kind of turns it sideways and just hopes to win. And that's why people like Artabax have had such good success with this deck, whereas other people, they may struggle in certain matchups and just auto lose them, so to speak, like against certain steel decks. But with the right mindset and with the right lines of play, utilizing certain combo pieces, you can end up overcoming those tough matchups. And I've talked about this many times in videos before, but like, you don't necessarily want to play a deck because it combos, because again, the odds that you see this every time you need to see it is like slim to nil, right? Like, you'll see it sometimes, and when you see it, it's great. But in isolation, all of these cards work very well together, and they combo with other things in the deck, let's say. So you don't necessarily need to see specific pieces all the time, because you're not going to run into that situation all the time. You have to be able to play a little bit more versatile in order to be successful. I was struggling for a 60th card, so I opted to put in 1 Strike a Good Match. You could play more of this. I think it is a very good card, because to me, it is essentially Friends on the Other Side. It costs 2. It's a song. Ursula will draw 4 off of it. Yes, you have to discard 2 when you sing it with Ursula, but the whole point is you're thinning out your deck. You're getting rid of cards that aren't useful. You're drawing into cards that are useful in the moment, that can help save you in a certain situation or develop your board to a state where it's very difficult to deal with. So I kind of view these as the same. Again, I could be wrong. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. But I really do like Strike a Good Match. And if you could play more copies, I would. But I'm just testing out the 1 for now. Instead of things like Bippity Boppity Boos or Bosses on a Roll, I just think the card draw that you get off of this, and technically the advantage, right? Because if you sing it with Ursula, you're drawing those extra cards, even though you are discarding 1, but you're drawing extra cards because of the Ursula double sing effect. So it still gets you card advantage overall. Shouldn't need any explanation for MIM Fox. Probably one of the best Amethyst cards in the game still. Tremendous value, able to help you stabilize against other boards, because while you are an aggro deck, you still need to have some sort of board control. Otherwise, your opponent is just going to keep running over all your threats, and you will likely not be able to outquest them if they have their board developed and they're outing your threats. And you quest once, but then you lose your board, and you may quest for 1 next turn, but they'll quest for 3 or 4, right? So having the MIM Fox is still very important. Plus the bounce factor, like I said, synergizes well with cards you want to protect, like the Cursed Merfolk, like the Flynn Rider. Those early cheap drops that quest for 2 are very powerful. Speaking of more resiliency, I'm opting to play 3 copies of Merlin Crab. This is just a very good card overall. A 3 for 3/3 is just decent, plus the effect that is able to be triggered when play and bounced is very powerful. This combination here, playing a crab or bouncing a crab and then boosting up a MIM Fox here is very relevant, because at 7 strength, you out very powerful locations like Pride Lands. Again, if you watch my gameplay video linked in the description, I think this combination, maybe not in that video, but it definitely would out a Pride's Land instantly, which is very relevant. It outs Queen's Castle, which are pretty much the 2 most prominent locations in the game right now. And this card can also help you run over McDuck Manners to a certain extent, right? With pairing it with something else. So Crab, just good overall. Obviously helps you run over other big characters that could be a threat. And paired with the MIM Fox, it continues to work very well. Now, something I did not include in my gameplay video was 3 Maleficent Sorceress. I don't necessarily think you absolutely need this, considering you have some really good 3-drop options as is, and we'll get to the the main ones on the Emerald side in just a second. But in certain scenarios, you may not want to play an Ursula Deceiver of All, you may not want to cast the Merlin Rabbit, and just having something generic that you can throw down for a 3 cost and just, it replaces itself, you want to dig through your deck, is still good, and at worst it's ink. So Maleficent continues to be kind of mid, but good enough that I think you can warrant playing a couple of copies of this. And in the topping deck lists for this deck, you are seeing Maleficent Sorceress being played. Now, you can play 3 copies of Cloud Kicker. I'm only opting for 2 here. Again, this card can be pretty relevant against certain decks, especially other aggro decks that might aim to outrace you. But for example, like if you look at, like let's just say a mirror match, pretty much everything in the 1 and 2 drop slot except for MIM Snake can get bounced with the Cloud Kicker. Not that you necessarily want to bounce an Ursula Deceiver, but let's just say you're on the play and your opponent drops a Flynn Rider or some other aggro threat, if you're in the mirror or not, and then on turn 3 you play Cloud Kicker, you bounce this back to hand. That is such a huge tempo swing for you, especially in an aggro mirror where you really care about questing. Like, you putting your opponent behind 2 lore off of that quest can literally be a game-winning play. So as early as turn 3 on the tempo curve there, having something like this could literally win you the game that early. Again, probably too early to say, but it can literally be one of the major contributing factors for you winning a game. The thing that makes the deck work now in this set, or in this format, compared to the Rise of the Floodborn and or the first chapter set, is Ursula Deceiver of All. Yes, this is the money card for the deck, unfortunately, otherwise the deck would be dirt cheap. But yeah, Ursula Deceiver of All, you have to play 4, because the way that this deck works now is the advantage of being able to generate +4, or technically +3, because, this costs 1, or this, is a physical card that you're replacing. But drawing 4 for 1 card is very, very strong. And this is why I said Strike a Good Match, I think, is still a good value in this deck. But with aggro, as you probably know if you've ever played aggro, you're constantly struggling to protect your cards. Like, yes, it's nice to quest with them, get your lore, and something like a Maleficent biding her time, once it gets outed, it provides no other value other than getting you that 2 lore. But that's why something like Curse Merfolk is so much better, because at least it'll force a discard on your opponent's end, so it trades 1 for 1 while getting you the lore. However, you still lose that board presence, you still lose tempo, it doesn't actually generate you card advantage. And if your opponent discards something that isn't really useful for them, or they have other ways to draw cards, let's say off a Hiram engine or Merlin Rabbit on Amethyst side, or whatever it might be, you're technically still behind. But with Ursula Deceiver of All singing a Friends on the other side, that draw 4 to replenish your hand gives you so many more aggro options to continue to drop, and it just gives you enough gas to push through whatever your opponent has for removal. And so you're fine questing and taking negative trades in order to generate lore, because I'm going to be able to claw back that advantage with something like an Ursula Deceiver, and that's why this card is so good in the deck. Also, pairing it with literally your only real form of removal. I mean, you can challenge things, but let's say your opponent has a ready threat, that's a big problem, and assuming it doesn't have ward, being able to bounce 2 things with Mother Knows Best, again, is one of those things that can be a game-winning play for you. On turn 4, on turn 5, whenever it might be, slowing them down by a turn is so crucial. If you watch my gameplay video, you would have seen me Mother Knows Best away a Robin Hood, which allowed me to draw extra cards off of my Queen's Castle, because they couldn't challenge it to remove it, or challenge the characters that were there in order to prevent me from drawing. And the extra lore gain that I got off the Queen's Castle literally came down to the wire, and one of the reasons why I won that game against Amber Steel Song, which is a terrible matchup for this deck. But otherwise I would have lost. So like, this card, playing it in the right time, seeing it at the right time, getting a double bounce potentially, can again be one of those game-winning plays for this deck, because you don't need a lot to win with this. You just need to edge out small little tempo advantages in order to keep things like your Queen's Castle, like your characters on board that 1 extra turn, so that you can get that big quest off or continue that pressure and close out the game. Speaking of our 4 drops, we are going with the full-on Merlin package. 4 goats and 4 rabbits. This, I think, is pretty mandatory for the deck. One of the reasons why Amethyst continues to be a powerhouse in the format is because you have those non-questing sources of lore. Being able to drop goat, bounce it back, quest with it, challenge things, since it's a pretty overstated body for its effect, is very powerful. Just like with the MIM Fox, this card with the rabbit puts it up to a 7 strength character, which can run over a lot of things. And you generally don't feel too bad just ramming your goat into something and getting the lore anyways. So it basically is, I out a threat and I generated 2 lore when I played it and challenged and it got banished. So it doesn't feel bad when you lose this card. The rabbit as well, another just key draw engine for the deck that you don't necessarily feel too bad when you lose, because you do have those other very powerful sources of lore card draw generation. But Merlin Rabbit continues to represent incredible value. When it's on board, you can just quest with it. Your opponent has to out it eventually, and then you draw a card regardless. So it represents card draw and lore gain at the very least. And then to top things out, we are running 3 copies of the Queen's Castle. It's surprising how impressive this card is in this deck, because with aggro, your strategy is usually I'm just going to go as wide as I can on a board sometimes, and then just throwing down a Queen's Castle and putting some stuff there. Your opponent now has to make the decision, do I out the characters or do I out the castle? If they don't have enough to out the castle right away, they're likely not going to throw things into it to just damage it if you have characters there, because they need to deal with the characters to prevent your extra card draw. That's how good this card is in this deck, where it forces your opponent to make a decision. Do I leave their characters on board, which will continue to quest and potentially give them draws, or do I have to out the Queen's Castle, or do I out the characters and leave the Queen's Castle to prevent the draws, but I have to deal with the fact that they're going to get 2 lore every turn off of this thing, and it can be a problem. And like I said, once you establish these, and if you have something like a Mother Knows Best or anything to really slow the opponent down, this card is just basically free lore, because it's so hard to out when you have the threat of other characters on board. And again, the card draw is just insane. Like being able, like in the mid to late game, when you're kind of in top deck mode or something, like just drawing an extra card or an extra 2 cards and then being able to play out your whole hand, because your whole deck is basically 4 cost or less, right? So let's say you're on 7 or 8 ink in the mid to late game and you're like, yeah, whatever I draw, I'm just dropping multiple copies up. It's very hard to deal with, and it's why this deck can be very successful if your opponent doesn't have that constant removal for your threats. Now, to round out the deck, something I also did not play in my gameplay video because I was testing out some tech options, but I've opted to go back to Yzma. This is just extra removal for you. Like if you're in a dire situation, like I've explained before, you're not necessarily looking at generating card advantage from your removal. Like Mother Knows Best is actually negative card advantage, right? Because it bounces the card back to your opponent's hand. They still have the resource, but it's a tempo disruptor, right? It outs a threat on your board because you value things on your board more than what's on the opponent's board and generating an advantage from that. You care more about, hey, I'm going to bounce your Tinkerbell, your Robin Hood, whatever your big threat is, so that my Queen's Castle can stay up, so that my characters can stay up, so that you're not going to be able to challenge my Merfolk or my Flynn Rider. I'm going to get the extra quest out of them, and you know, that's just enough for me to edge out a little bit of an advantage to win the game. Yzma is kind of that same concept, where you can use this more frequently than you would in any other deck to out an opponent's threat. Yes, you give them a draw too, but you've removed a threat from their board, which means that it's one less threat to challenge your characters, to out your location, and you're just, again, pushing for game from there. Of course, in certain scenarios, this card can also act as a way for you to draw cards, and especially when you use it on like a rabbit or a goat, you gain the extra lore. When you bounce a goat back, you draw a 3rd card, because 2 off Yzma, 1 off rabbit when you bounce it back into the deck. And it can be a very versatile option for that. But this is one of the cards that works better in this deck than any other, for the sheer fact that you are a little bit more inclined to use it on your opponent's threats to slow them down. Let's say you were on the draw and you just need that little bit of advantage to claw back that draw, that on the play advantage your opponent had. And Yzma, just like Mother Knows Best, is a potential card to do that. And that's why I've opted to re-include these. And again, in the top tournament deck list where this deck has been doing very well, you are seeing Yzma being played. Only at 2, you could cut it from the list. You don't necessarily have to play it, but it's good to have some more top end option removal for when you do get into a bit of a grind game and just being able to clutch out a game that way. So overall, that is my deck list. Again, Befuddles and Bippity Boppity Boos are interesting tech options that you could play, not necessarily 100% needed, Befuddle is very good though, I will say, especially when you can bounce back something like a Captain Hook or a Mr. Smee on the steel side, because that just really slows down the opposing decks. Even something like a Morph to stop a shift in the Emerald Steel matchup, because again, the steel matchups are your toughest bets against, using this deck. They are what you will struggle with the most likely. This deck does do well into the format though. Again, on the play, this deck on its, on a decent draw, which is very easy to do since your whole curve is very cheap, can beat anything, I think. On the draw, it's on the play it can beat anything. On the draw, it's a little bit more of a struggle. Like I said, you have to really eye your places for where you can generate advantage. But having cards like Ursula and Mother Knows Best are things that can help swing tempo in your favor. But that being said, your opponent is likely a good player who knows how to manage tempo themselves, right? So it really comes down to the pilot of the deck and whether it can do good. Being aggro, though, it does do very well into control. So if you're in a control heavy meta where a lot of people are on things like Ruby Amethyst, Ruby Sapphire, basically Ruby decks, this deck does very well. Emerald does very well against slow decks. But if you're into a lot of steel, this deck might struggle. It will struggle against Amber Steel Song, Emerald Steel, to a certain extent Sapphire Steel, because if they're playing a little bit more of the lower end removal, this deck can struggle. And once they get to the top end removal, it's very hard for this deck to deal with it. But again, you do have some options like Ursula Deceiver to help you generate a bit of a stabilized board state by outing some songs in their hand. Anyways, guys, this video is getting over 20 minutes, so let's go ahead and wrap it up. Let me know in the comment section below if you've made it this far, if you enjoy these live deck profiles, and what you would like to see next, potentially. This is a bit of a change of pace from the control decks that we've been looking at, but again, any feedback is appreciated. Thank you again for watching. Quantum is out.